Have you ever wondered what goes on outside your window when you sleep? For there, behind the curtain in the thick darkness, there may be something hiding there that is better not to know. Today, I will tell you a story that happened to me one night. It began the same way many nights do, but it ended very differently. Stay to the end and you'll find out what I saw outside my window. Believe me, it changed my view of what we call reality. Get ready, because this story will make you look at your cozy home differently. And if you think you're safe inside four walls, this story might make you change your mind. Autumn evenings always carry a special atmosphere. On this day, it was not just raining outside the window. It seemed that nature itself was trying to say something. The wind was moaning like an aggrieved spirit, and wet leaves were flying in the air, sticking to the window panes. I sat in my room, where it was warm and cozy. A mug of hot tea stood beside me, and a lamp cast a soft light on the old wooden table. Nothing seemed to portend strangeness. It was one of those moments when you feel protected from the outside world. But sometimes the feeling of comfort is only an illusion. The room was filled with silence, broken only by the sounds of the rain and the creaking of the wind. I tried to concentrate on my work, but this oppressive autumn atmosphere caused a slight uneasiness that grew stronger by the minute. I continued to work, but gradually something began to distract me. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. It happens when you're tired. Your brain starts throwing up strange sensations. Soon, however, I felt as if someone was watching me. It was hard to explain in words, but the feeling was palpable. It was as if someone's eyes were drilling into my back. This sensation made me involuntarily turn around. My eyes slid around the room, then to the window. There didn't seem to be anything suspicious. The curtains were slightly open, and all I could see were tree branches flickering in the lamplight. They darted back and forth as if in some sinister dance. I shook my head, shaking the strange thoughts away, and went back to work. But the tension was growing. I noticed that my eyes were turning to the window more and more often on their own. Each time I tried to convince myself that it was silly, because there could be nothing behind the glass. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. At one point, I even got up to close the curtains, but I didn't. The light from the lantern helps me work, I thought. But the real reason was that I didn't want to appear a coward to myself. To close the curtains would be to admit that I was afraid, and then I heard it. It was a faint but distinct knocking sound. At first I thought it was just the sound of the wind. Houses often make strange noises in this weather. But it came again. A slow, rhythmic pounding that didn't fit at all with the background cacophony of rain and wind. It was jarringly out of tune. The sound was insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. It was coming from the exact side where the window was. I felt goosebumps run up my spine. I rose slowly from my chair, feeling the tension in the room build. It wasn't fear in the usual sense, but rather a mixture of anxiety and a gut feeling that something was close by. The knocking continued, not loud, but distinct, as if someone was deliberately waiting before each blow. A knock, a pause, a knock. It sounded so rhythmically that it was like some kind of tapping. Slowly, almost on tiptoe, I moved toward the window. Inside I was screaming, "Stay away, this is a bad idea." But curiosity overpowered me. As I got closer, my heart pounded harder and fear began to throb in my temples. Every muscle in my body tensed, as if preparing to face something unknown. When I was a few steps away from the window, I noticed that the air around me felt denser. It was a strange sensation, as if the room suddenly became harder to breathe. Finally, I stopped right in front of the curtain. The knocking had stopped, but now the silence was even more ominous. I gently pulled back the edge of the curtain and peered behind it. There was only darkness outside the window. My eyes slid quickly across the garden, lit by the dim light of the lantern. There was nothing there, just wet trees swaying in the wind and the rain drumming on the green. It seemed like nothing out of the ordinary, but inside I wasn't convinced. I even deliberately looked at every branch, every detail, in case I missed something. But the garden looked completely ordinary. I sighed and felt the tension release a little. Just a breeze or a pounding rain, I thought. But at that moment I noticed something strange. There was a drop of water on the glass at the level of my gaze, which, flowing downward, seemed to outline the contours of something that looked like a face. It only lasted a second, but it made me recoil. "It's only a drop," I said aloud, as if trying to convince myself that it was a drop. Taking a deep breath, I went back to the table and sat down again, but just as I calmed down, the knocking came again. This time it was louder. It was like it was tearing through the stillness of the room, filling it with a strange, cold tension. The knocking became even more insistent, as if someone was demanding that I come out. I turned to the window, trying to find the source of the sound with my eyes. But everything looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes ago. Just the rain, the shadows of the trees. Maybe it was a branch after all. I thought and tried to imagine how that was possible, but deep down I knew it wasn't. A branch couldn't be knocking with such regularity, couldn't be knocking me off balance like that. Everything inside me was telling me to find out what was going on. I finally made up my mind. Taking the flashlight that was always on the shelf by the door, I threw on my jacket and headed for the exit. The street greeted me with freezing rain and a heavy wind. The air was so cold that it felt like it was cutting into my skin. I turned on the flashlight and started toward where the window was. The beam of light darted across the garden, picking out the M from the darkness. When I got closer to the window, I could still see the rain stains on the glass. In the lantern light, they looked like strange patterns, thin lines crisscrossing in chaotic patterns. I scrutinized the window from the outside, but nothing unobjectionable. However, when I turned around to go back, out of the corner of my eye I caught a movement. It was so fast that at first I thought I was imagining it. But no. In the light of the flashlight near one of the trees I saw something. It was a silhouette. Tall, thin, elongated, with disproportionately long limbs. It stood perfectly still, blending in with the branches of the tree, but I clearly understood. It was not part of nature. My breath froze. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. As if it were watching, my instinct screamed, "Run!" I could not move, however. I stood mesmerized, staring at this strange creature. It was unnatural. It was wrong. For a moment it even seemed to me that its head turned to mine. That motionless figure in the dark was the creepiest thing I had ever seen. Time seemed to stop and I was trapped in the night. The silhouette remained motionless, which made it even more frightening. If it moved, I could write it off to the wind, but its ominous stillness was unnerving. The tall figure was too thin for a man. Her proportions seemed ridiculously elongated, especially her arms, which hung lower than the debt. The rain streaming down the glass blurred the outline slightly, but I saw her clearly enough to know she was looking at me. But how? I couldn't see her face, just a dark spot where her head had been, which seemed to turn toward me. My heart hammered harder, and I began to think frantically about what to do next. Stand and wait, run away, or try to get a closer look at it. Inside me there was a struggle between fear and curiosity. But when the figure swayed slightly in my direction, I knew I had to do something. I ventured a step forward to get a better look at her. The flashlight was pointed directly at the silhouette, but the light didn't seem to reach it. It was strange. It was as if the figure was absorbing the light, leaving a dark blur around it. With each step, I felt fear literally squeezing me from the inside out. A feeling of heaviness hung in the air, as if the space around me had grown thicker. Even the rain seemed muffled and the sounds of the wind seemed distant. All my attention focused on the creature. I could see her even better now. Her body seemed unnaturally curved, as if she were made of something soft, but her movements remained minimal. It was as if she was waiting. And in that moment, I realized that she was aware of my presence. The feeling was almost physical, as if her gaze, invisible and devoid of eyes, was burning through me. I didn't know what to do, but my feet kept moving forward, as if I were hypnotized. As I stepped closer, the figure shifted slightly, its head tilted as if studying me. The movement was so smooth and abnormal that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. At that moment, I felt that I couldn't stay here any longer. Everything inside me was screaming danger, but I still couldn't move. It was as if my body was not obeying me. Then the figure began to move. Her movement was abrupt, jerky, as if she was not moving on her own, but was being pushed by someone. It took a step in my direction, and I finally realized I had to run away. I turned around and raced toward the house. The rain was pouring down my face, and the flashlight was shaking in my hands, but I didn't stop. I could feel the creature moving behind me. Though I couldn't hear footsteps, its presence was palpable. It was like a shadow that clung to you wherever you went. When I reached the door, I frantically started to open it. The key didn't go into the keyhole right away, and my hands were shaking so badly that I was afraid I'd drop it. When I opened the door, I rushed inside, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it immediately. I stood with my back against the door, breathing heavily. My heart was beating so hard I thought it was going to jump out of my chest. It was still raining outside, but it didn't feel like rain anymore. Every sound of droplets hitting the roof or the glass gave me a new rush of fear. I looked cautiously out the window, trying to see where the figure was. But there was nothing to be seen outside, just the same rain-drenched garden and swaying trees. I wanted to convince myself that it was all my imagination, that the figure had simply vanished into the darkness, but in my heart, I knew it was somewhere near. My mind told me that the danger was not over, but had retreated, only to return when I least expected it. I stood at the door, feeling the tension seep into every cell of my body. I could see nothing outside, just the dark garden, blurred by the rain. I knew, however, that the figure was somewhere nearby. The feeling was too real to ignore. I tried to step away from the door and gather my thoughts, but my body wouldn't listen. It felt like I was in some kind of daze, like fear had taken me captive. The room was quiet, too quiet. Even the sounds of rain and wind outside the window seemed distant now, as if I were inside some isolated zone. Suddenly I heard a faint noise. It was something like a creaking sound. It might have been the sound of wood swaying in the wind, but it wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from inside the house. My breathing became frequent, and I turned around to see exactly where the sound was coming from. I slowly began to circle the room, holding the same flashlight that now seemed to be my only means of defense. Step by step I moved, but I didn't notice anything. Still, the feeling that someone was nearby grew stronger and stronger. I heard it again, a knock. But this time it didn't sound from outside, like before, but from inside. The same rhythmic, measured knock, as if someone wanted to get my attention. The sound came from the corner of the room where a large mirror stood, covered in a light layer of dust. I froze. Two feelings warred within me: the desire to approach and the fear that gripped my entire body. My heart pounded wildly, but I took a step, then another, and another. Now I was only a few steps from the mirror, and the knocking grew louder. I looked at my reflection. It seemed ordinary, but something was wrong with it. It seemed like my own figure in the mirror was standing a little differently, not exactly repeating my movements. I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself that it was just fatigue and overblown fears. But then I noticed a movement. In the reflection behind me, a shadow appeared. It moved slowly, smoothly, but it was clear that it wasn't just the play of light. It was the same figure I had seen in the garden. Its hands reached forward, and its head seemed to tilt to look at me. I turned around so abruptly that I almost dropped the flashlight. There was no one in the room. I looked at every corner, every shadow, but everything looked familiar. But in the reflection of the mirror, the figure continued to stand behind me. It did not move, but its presence was frighteningly real. I took a step back, trying to get away from the mirror, but the figure seemed to become closer. Its arms stretched even further, and it seemed to me that it was trying to reach me. My breathing became intermittent, and my legs were shaking so much that I could barely stay in place. Suddenly, the lamp on the table flickered, and the room was plunged into semi-darkness. The only source of light was my flashlight. But even its beam began to flicker, as if the batteries were about to run out. I realized that time was short, and I needed to do something. I turned around again to look in the mirror, but the figure was no longer there. Its disappearance was even more frightening than its presence. I didn't know where she was now, but I felt that she was still nearby, perhaps even closer. I stood there trying to collect my thoughts when I heard the knock again. This time it was coming not from the mirror but from the window, the same rhythmic, slow knock that had started it all. I walked up to the window trying to keep my distance and saw that the figure had appeared behind the glass again. This time she was standing even closer. Her silhouette was unnaturally elongated, and her head was tilted so that it seemed as if she was studying me. I felt that she was not just looking, she was waiting. I wanted to close the curtains, but my hands simply did not obey. My body was paralyzed with fear, and inside there was only one feeling. I needed to run. But where? The figure suddenly began to slowly dissolve into the air. It was like smoke that was picked up by the wind and carried away. Only drops of rain remained on the glass, flowing down. But even after she disappeared, I still felt her presence. That night left an indelible mark on me. Now I realized that some things cannot be explained logically. This creature, whatever it was, clearly came for a reason. Perhaps it wanted to warn, or perhaps it had an entirely different purpose. I don't know. But since that night I have never left the windows open, and I have removed the mirror from the room forever. After that night, I couldn't come to my senses for a long time. Fear and a strange feeling of uncertainty followed me everywhere. Even during the day when the sun flooded the room with light, I didn't feel safe. It seemed that the figure I saw outside the window and in the mirror was still somewhere nearby. To somehow understand what had happened, I began to study the history of my house. It seemed to me that such things do not just happen. Perhaps there were some old legends or events associated with this place. I found some information in the local archive. It turned out that my house was built on the site of a small chapel. It was destroyed more than a century ago, presumably during a fire. According to legend, this chapel was owned by a woman who lost her child. After his death, she spent the rest of her life in mourning, considering herself guilty of his death. They say that she often sat on the threshold of the chapel, looking into the forest and waiting for her child to return someday. But the most terrifying thing was that some old-timers told about strange phenomena in this place. People passing by saw a tall figure standing between the trees. It was described as too elongated and dark, with long arms hanging below the knees. They said that this was the spirit of a woman who was still looking for her child, wandering at night. I didn't want to believe it. It seemed to me that I was just too scared and finding confirmation of my fears. But the description matched too accurately. My head was full of thoughts, and I didn't know how to get rid of this horror. Since then, much has changed in how I go about my life. Now, before I go to bed, I always draw the curtains tightly. Even the faintest glimmer of light from the window or its reflection makes me uneasy. I removed the mirror from that room. I can no longer look into mirrors at night. They feel like portals through which one can glimpse things that don't belong to our world. Sometimes, even with the windows and curtains tightly closed, I wake up feeling as though someone is watching me. I can feel their gaze. Occasionally, I hear those same sounds, a quiet, barely perceptible knocking. It doesn't happen often, but every time, it gives me chills. I try to ignore it, convincing myself it's just the old house creaking or the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I know it's something more. I've come to see the world differently. I've realized that not everything in our lives can be explained rationally. Some things remain a mystery, hidden behind the veil of reality. And sometimes that veil becomes thinner, allowing what lies on the other side to briefly appear in our world. I often think about that figure. Why did it appear? What did it want? I never found any answers. But one thing I know for sure, that encounter changed me forever. Now, I always feel that something is nearby, especially in the stillness of the night. Maybe you've noticed something similar. Perhaps late at night, you've heard a strange sound outside your window or seen a shadow where there shouldn't be one. If so, then perhaps we've experienced the same thing. This story will remain etched in my memory forever. It taught me to be cautious, to pay attention to the little details, and to wonder about the things happening around me. Sometimes, things that seem insignificant may be far more important than we think. This story made me believe that not everything in our world can be explained logically. Do you think there is something on the other side of reality? Write in the comments. If this story made you think or gave you goosebumps, like it, subscribe to my channel and click the bell so you don't miss the next videos. Let's get 5,000 likes, and I'll tell you another story that shocked me.